All right, so let's take a look here at, again, kind of the tail of the tapes as far as what is going on between North and South states and where kind of the disagreements are. So, again, it has to do a lot with population size and who we are counting. So, again, if you're a northern state where you don't have slavery, you don't want the slaves to count as far as the population because then that gives the South more people. It gives them more representation for the House of Representatives. And from the counter, that would be if you're the South, you do want that because you want them to be able to give you more of a population. The flip side of that is if you're the South, you don't want them to be counted when levying taxes because that means that your state has to pay a larger proportional amount of taxes to the federal government. And same thing from the North, if you do want them to count towards the slaves because they do want to pay more in taxes. So again, it's all about the House of Representatives here because it's based on population. And this is where the 3/5 compromise comes into. What the North and the South decide on is that slaves will count as a 3/5 of a person. They will count as 3/5 of the population size towards taxation and representation. And what that does, it gives them some additional numbers towards represented in the House, but doesn't give them a full person. Because a state like South Carolina that has more slaves than free whites, the North does not want them to have that much more of a say based off their slave labor. So the 3/5 would kind of be of a way of the North trying to limit the power of the South and eventually, hopefully, work towards an abolition movement altogether. And that then brings us to the next issue, which should be whether slavery remains or not. And this actually was a common dilemma between certain founding fathers of the North and of the South was many of them wanted to try to get rid of slavery. They thought that the Constitutional Convention could be a way to enshrine getting rid of slavery. However, it was a difficult measure, and they were not quite able to do so. They had states like South Carolina and Georgia who just refused to sign any kind of constitution that would outlaw the slavery altogether. And there is no process for states to secede or not. So oftentimes you had states, especially like South Carolina, who will threaten to secede if their way of life the allowing of slavery would be threatened. So what they decided to compromise on is the eventual abolition of the slave trade. So no new slaves are being brought into the country, and that will happen in the early 1800s. And in return, any slaves that were caught, runaway slaves, had to be returned to their masters. And we'll talk about this again when we get to the early abolition movement during the antebellum period. But essentially, if a slave fled to a northern state like Massachusetts and they were caught, they would have to be returned to their slave in the South, or their slave owner, in the South. Now here we look at James Madison. He is really the father of this Constitution. Again, like I mentioned earlier, this was not an easy process. This was not a document that the entirety of the Congress agreed to. There was many discussions and dilemmas brought up between you have the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists who want more of the blue side here. They want a stronger central government. They want them to be able to have more power than the states. While on the flip side of that, you have the Anti-Federalists who want stronger states, more like the Articles of Confederation that we saw earlier. You have these dilemmas between large and small states, whether we have a bicameral or a unicameral house. And all of these things are kind of explicitly making it difficult to do, and it's up to the works of James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay, who are going to write the Federalist Papers, and we'll read some of the Federalist Papers in class together, as ways to try to convince people to join their side, because each state had to independently, their state legislators had to vote to approve the Constitution, and they had to try to get all of the states to vote on it and to join, or they were going to have issues as far as certain states not being a part of the government. So we will dive more in depth in class as far as the elements of the Constitution, the breakdowns of it with the different amendments of the Bill of Rights, with the different articles and the different processes that are kind of brought up in there. But as far as the breakdown, kind of the layout of it that we've already gone through in this video, if you have any questions, please come in with them in class and we will talk about them together.